Good afternoon, good morning and good evening, depending on where in the world you are, and welcome to this week's PRCA Taskforce Forum. I'm delighted to say we have both a world-class panel and a worldwide panel this week, all of whom I can vouch for personally as being simply outstanding at what they do. So I'm going to just introduce people, then hand over to Matt Peacock, who is going to chair today's session. And hopefully it'll be yet another engaging and engaged exercise. So Matt, I mentioned, many of you will know. He is a consultant, he's head of corporate and ESG at Blurred, having spent time in senior corporate affairs roles at Vodafone, BG Group, Ofcom and the BBC, so his reputation goes before him. Laura Sutphen, currently joining us very, very early in Chicago with her coffee. Laura is a former colleague and she is now global head of purpose at Golin, an agency that needs no introduction. Girish Balachandran, coming to us live from Delhi. He is the founder and managing partner of On Purpose Comms, a remarkable purpose-focused agency in India. Girish has spent time previously at Avian Media, WE and Ketchum. And then finally, Ben Page, who, if there's anyone here who doesn't know Ben Page, you'll have been living under a rock. Ben is the CEO of Ipsos Mori and has, I believe, some remarkable insights to bring from the Global Trends 2020 report that Ipsos brought out earlier this year. And just generally, Ben sadly can only join us for the first half hour, but I guarantee a fun-packed and insight-packed contribution from him. So with no further ado, those are the introductions, and I will hand over to Matt to chair today's session, and we'll turn my screen off and let you enjoy. So thanks for joining. Matt, over to you.
Great, thanks Rod, and good afternoon everyone, or good morning or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. So thank you for joining us. So what we're talking about here is conscious capitalism. Is this really the shift that the world has been waiting for in the world of business? Or are we about to discover that all the warm words that companies have used in recent years about purpose and about ESG, environmental, social governance, doing the right thing by society, doing the right thing by the planet, are we about to discover that all of that actually is just words, and that when companies are under pressure, as they are now because of COVID, actually ESG and purpose turns out to be a luxury good that they can't afford? So that's what we're going to talk about. Laura, let me start with you, just from a purpose perspective and what you see with your clients and what you see across industry generally. Is purpose here to stay? Is it real? Will it survive COVID? Or is it just woke washing and really not going to survive?
Woke washing is a very apt term, especially for what we're seeing over the last couple of weeks with the all of the racial protests and all of the injustices. We just had the funeral of George Floyd yesterday, which was broadcast globally by CNN and put another spotlight on a social issue that a lot of brands are contending with right now. But even before that, I think from a COVID perspective, this is the first time that people and brands around the world have been united around a common issue. Most brands spend an inordinate amount of time trying to find their purpose and manifest it through partnerships and social good and other ways of showing impact. And now I think we've got a bit of a reckoning where brands are realizing that the purpose or the social impact drivers that they set up so carefully are now being tested and challenged. And consumers are no longer willing to believe unless they are seeing and they can actually experience some of the actual true impact that a brand can make. So I don't think that it's going, the age of purpose is going to go away in COVID. I think that we are in a reckoning and we're in a reshaping period.
Ben, from a kind of public sentiment point of view and from what you see in your research, are people buying it? Do they actually believe that businesses are serious when they say this stuff?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think there's a general trend, and expectations of business have risen dramatically since the 1970s. So it's now not good enough just to be, to be legal. You have to do all of these things. So I think expectations are rising. 3/4 of people globally say that you can make money and do good at the same time. So I think there is some willingness for business to do that stuff, but it is difficult. And if you're a large employer, I mean, the whole Black Lives Matter thing is a sort of minefield, because you start to do it, you try and help one group in your population, and then another group will say, well, what about us? And so I think it's interesting how these things are dragged into the world of work, and because ultimately politics is culture, culture is politics, it's inescapable. So no, purpose is here to stay. The debate's going to go on. I think what I find interesting in all of this is not just how business is going to react, but what sort of general environment we're going to find ourselves in as we go into the 2020s, with recession in many Western economies, with governments spending, with much more interventionist government in every possible way. And does that mean that actually the virus and this whole closure this year means that we start to take stock on who, perhaps how rewards are distributed in society? No guarantees, but the trend since the 1970s has been inexorably in favor of people who own assets and not in favor of people who work for a living. Is this finally a moment where it changes shape?
Girish, in a second, I'm going to ask you about the perspective from India. But before I do that, just a quick word to everyone on the webinar. Please feel free to ask questions using the chat panel, and we'll pick up your questions in real time. So please do feel free to join in the conversation. So Girish, look, from the perspective of business and society in India, I mean, the ESG movement, so environmental social governance, ESG, and indeed purpose, certainly from my experience, really started in Europe. Europe has been a leader. The US, I would say generally, I don't know if you'd agree with this, Laura, is a few years behind ESG across all of corporates. And emerging markets, including India, are probably a little bit behind the US. It's, again, my perspective. Is that your perspective as well? What's the position in corporate life in India with regards to purpose and conscious capitalism?
I think on both aspects, it's fairly nascent, both with the concept of purpose and also with the concept of sort of conscious capitalism. I think in India, we're still sort of coming to terms with the concept of CSR to begin with. And that's largely due to the fact that the government actually passed a law in 2013 that's made CSR mandatory, and a compliance-driven thing where companies have to contribute a minimum of 2% of their profits if they surpass a certain size of revenue and profitability. So as a result of this, what's happened is there's definitely an effort where companies are sort of making the conscious effort to be seen to be doing good, and now it's a compliance thing, so they have to produce a report with photographs of what they've been doing and sort of metrics around impact and that sort of stuff. But a lot of it is sort of really driven also by a huge sort of requirement almost to be seen to be aligning with the current government, and there's a lot of pressure on brands to do that. So a lot of the purpose and the sort of social impact work for brands tends to sort of align itself by either initiatives that the government is announcing or is supporting and wants to promote. I don't think we're sort of in a place where you'll see an Indian brand actually stand up and take a stand against something that isn't in alignment with what the government's doing.
Well, that's really interesting to mention. I mean, in a sense, what you're saying is, I think, quite a lot of this is driven by political risk. Yeah, it's not driven by, as it were, an innate understanding within the enterprise that they need to be different to survive over the long term. They need a different bond with society. It's actually more tactical around political relationships.
It is. I'd say you'd always find the exceptions, those who are sort of genuinely interested in doing good and making a difference, but they're few and far between.
Laura, what about in the US? Because, of course, the US has a deeply divided and volatile political environment. What are the factors driving corporations, companies big and small, towards purpose in the US, would you say?
Yeah, I was sort of taking mental stock as Girish was talking, because I was like, that would never work here right now. I think that there's two ways that divisiveness can go. It can unite, or it can do what we're seeing, which is to deeply polarize. And it is down to the neighborhood level, where if you drive down a street, I have neighbors where I live who have said that they don't want to put up signs that say Black Lives Matter because they're afraid of what their neighbors might think. And so I think I would love for, you know, the mantra to be one that is about everyone trying to move consciously in the right direction, and for there to be some level of provision that requires brands to contribute in a meaningful and consistent way. I just don't think that that's something that we would ever realize, at least maybe, you know, for the next number of months. It'll depend on what happens after November and beyond. But I think that there's going to be a huge healing that's going to happen before we start to see you know, the tide moving out in all the right direction. I think one other thing that it brings to mind is, you know, there's always been that discussion around the doing well by doing good. And, you know, 17, 18 years ago when I was working with eBay, that was the way that they were looking at purpose, right? That there could be a balance between putting out conscious good and earning back a profit. And they did it in some interesting ways of launching social businesses. And, you know, now their green team is recognized around the world as really being a catalyst for a lot of internal environmental change. But I think that that was an early way of showing that this can work if the balance is proper. And I just think here in the States that we are, you know, the last 2 years have shown us that we're well behind in where we could be if things would have been different.
Interesting question just come in from Kevin Ruck about employees and how organizations treat their employees. And just that strikes something for me, because a couple of conversations I've had recently with institutional investors have suggested that for some of them, ESG should be rebranded as SEG. So the societal piece comes first because of COVID, and particularly the internal stakeholders. So how companies treat their employees. Ben, from a sort of perception point of view and a sentiment point of view, do you see a shift in the focus around ESG and purpose a little bit away from where it's been traditionally, which is about climate and planet, and more towards how companies treat their own employees because of COVID?
Yeah, so I think COVID-19 has given Western societies a big reminder about the badly paid people who clean up, who keep our work, everything clean, who deliver goods, who don't earn very much money, who look after us, who drive goods around, all of those essential worker jobs that also turn out to be some of the worst paid jobs in society. Whether this leads to a permanent shift, I'm not sure, because I think there's a broader issue about more government intervention, government spending. But no, I think you will see that, and of course the companies that behave responsibly, it helps build their reputation. But having said that, I mean, Amazon has come into quite a lot of flack over what's been happening in its warehouses over the last five or more years, and they have now made some improvements, and there were some problems, but it doesn't seem to stop them being a lean, mean machine. So I think while I think the attention is there, and I think people doing jobs like us, and I think boards will keep looking at this, and expectations will keep rising, it is fair to say, if we go back to Amazon, that Amazon is just bulldozing everything before it, and whatever happens in its warehouses, quite frankly, if consumers find it convenient, effective, and well priced, it looks like that overcomes any squeamishness they have about it.
Well, actually, that's a really good point. I mean, look, isn't there to be cynical about it? I mean, we've been here before, right? Where the public say they feel very strongly about something, but actually it doesn't translate into consumer purchasing decisions. And I wonder, Girish, if that's also the case in India, that you've seen this shift more towards CSR and responsibility towards environmental factors and so forth. But does that actually translate into market behavior? The decisions that consumers make about the brands they purchase?
Very rarely. I think in India, the sort of the differentiator for brands is still functionality and value. And we haven't sort of reached that stage where brands are being able to offer consumers, a new aspiration to be part of something being much bigger than themselves. Really, sorry.
You dropped out. Yeah.
So what we're really seeing is that a lot of the, again, the purpose sort of being conveyed from brands and their social impact work, etc., is really sort of geared more towards industry and peers to be seen to be doing good, rather than sort of direct relationship into more sales with consumers.
Yeah, one of the things, just to put a little bit of a marker around it for those of us in agency life, since the pandemic hit, so I run a specialty. We have other specialties within Golin. And one of the things that I've seen a dramatic shift on, and we've also seen it as immediate and urgent requests from our clients, is the intersection of issues in crisis, employee comms, and social impact. And our three specialties are working together more than ever. And it is driven by the question that you had asked, Matt, around, or that was asked by Kevin on employee relations, and is that becoming a driver? And so I actually do see a lot of merit for a rearrangement, even if it's not an actual rearrangement, but at least an inherent rearranged focus on the role of employee. I think we're finding that it is building better business, it's building better culture, it's building more conscious culture, and then it's allowing the brands to serve consumers or customers in a better way.
But what does that mean in concrete terms? All right, so what do companies, in terms of very specific actions, need to do differently to address, for example, all of the issues that the Black Lives Matter movement have identified, which are profound, have been there for generations, multidimensional? What are the immediate things that companies can and should do to address, let's just take Black Lives Matter as an example, as a kind of key societal risk? What should companies be doing to address the points that are raised?
I mean, at least from my perspective, I think the first thing that leadership needs to do is, well, there's two things. One is to listen to their employees and truly listen, not just listen on the top line, but listen to the deep rumbling that's happening within their cultures and fix from the inside out. I think that it's one thing to put a statement out on social media about how a brand stands with Black Lives Matter, but if they're not doing their own internal work, deeply, richly listening well, and then also looking at transparency around how they're setting their own diversity and inclusion goals, particularly around hiring equities, I think that we will not see much change from the inside out.
So a question from Mark to all of us, but Ben, I think I'll turn to you first to answer it. Do CEOs recognize that this is a hinge moment, that there's an inflection point driven by COVID, but actually also separately driven by events like what's happened in the US the last 2 weeks and the Black Lives Matter movement? Do CEOs sense that there's a shift in the weather?
Well, I haven't spoken to enough CEOs in the last 2 weeks to know about the murder of, in America and the reaction to it, or the police murder in America and the reaction to it. In terms of Black Lives Matter, I think in terms of COVID and the recession that follows, we are not going to have a recovery that will be like the recovery of 2008, where you have austerity, because that led to massive rising inequality in our society. So you're going to see more pressure on business. Businesses are going to have to reinvent themselves. We're facing depressed consumer demand. So I think, to be honest, the economy is going to trump Black Lives Matter, quite frankly, in terms of operating most businesses. But at the same time, I think Black Lives Matter is a big reminder, particularly for anybody working with a diverse workforce. I've got 120 different nationalities and ethnic groups just in our London office, that we need to talk about these issues much more. And in the same way that we've made a lot of, mental health is much more visible in many workplaces in the West, at least, than it was 20 years ago. LGBT stuff is massively more visible. I think this is another prod in the right direction in terms of, working towards more equality and trying to look at things like recruitment and promotion decisions. But I mean, ultimately, of course, many of the problems are not ones that business has necessarily created. My problem is there aren't enough black people in university. So I've taken away, you don't have to go to university to work for me anymore, but I've still got to get more black people to apply, which is an interesting challenge. But no, so I think it is a good prod in the right direction, but I think the recession and our recovery after COVID is obviously going to be much more impactful for business overall.
I mean, I'll just pick up on Mark's question myself, if I may. I mean, what we found at Blurred in our experience, and most of our work is around purpose and ESG, is interestingly, a lot of companies that we deal with do not see ESG as a discretionary budget line item. And I would say only really over the last couple of years, there's been a real shift in sentiment towards ESG within corporations, to the extent that ESG is now seen as an absolutely mandatory set of risks that need to be taken into account. And that's been driven by a bunch of different factors, but predominantly by institutional investors. I mean, there was a recent survey, which Ben, you may have seen, of the top 50 global asset managers, where 87% of the top 50 biggest institutional investors in the world now incorporate ESG in all of their investment decisions.
You don't want to make an investment that's going to get flooded or burned to the ground.
Exactly,
do you?
exactly.
It's going to be there.
And then the other element is this thing called TCFD. For those of you who don't know, this is the Taskforce on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, one of the worst acronyms in the business world, frankly. But what it basically means is that companies have to account for climate-related risk in their core financial reporting. And that means they have to make a detailed analysis of what, water constraints, what climate volatility, weather volatility would do to all of their assumptions over the long term about how they'll make money and their liabilities and their risks and so forth. That has seriously focused minds amongst CFOs within public companies. And it's only really started to bite in the last couple of years. So to answer Mark's point, certainly my experience, our experience at Blurred is that actually, yes, a lot of people who run certainly public companies are beginning to recognize that this is a hinge moment in history. Let me just come to you, Girish, and ask you the sort of same question from an Indian perspective. And what would need to change, do you think, within the business world in India in order for chief executives to recognize that this is more than just what you could call traditional CSR, that there is a really fundamental shift happening here within the relationship between business and society, and they need to do more than, I think, what you've been describing? What would need to change?
I think consumers will have to demand it. And unless we see that happening, I think we're still going to see a lot of sort of PR activity around the work being done, but no sort of direct connection with the genuine sort of reason to exist for the company. We still got instances where a lot of companies are sort of, still throwing greenhouse gases out of the window, but at the same time, sort of, talking about tree plantations and that sort of stuff. I think as we see more citizens become aware and vocal about their choices, I'm hoping that, we're going to see brands become sort of just be held more accountable for their actions. And I think, it's probably going to take a trigger moment. I don't know what that is, but it's probably going to have to be some sort of an incident that might sort of, take off and then create that spark to, set off a movement around the purpose of business being more than just for shareholders. What about the wider stakeholders? And that sort of conversation.
Girish, just to play with you for a second. There's a really interesting question coming from Yasmin about organizations, companies that haven't given their thoughts and opinions on the social climate, on the sort of societal challenges. And the question that strikes me about India is, if you think back before COVID to the tensions in India over the citizenship laws between Muslims and the majority Hindu population, and the really shocking examples of sectarian violence that we saw in India. In other cultures, in other countries, I would suggest there would have been pressure on business to have a view on that kind of societal disruption. Did any businesses comment on it in India? Did any businesses rise up and say, we are all as one? Did it present a unifying message, or did most businesses simply not want to engage with it because it's too divisive?
Not want to engage. It's not, the culture is not right for that sort of stand as yet. Dissent is not sort of encouraged. And if you're in a business and you depend on sort of government permissions and licenses and regulations, then you're definitely not encouraged to take a stand on those types of issues. There are sort of exceptions. I think there is one industrialist from a company called Bajaj, who sort of actually got to stand up in a conference and take a stand about maybe the direction in which the economy was moving, instead of being the regular cheerleader as most other sort of businesses tend to become. And of course, that got widespread coverage because it was the exception. But now, this person clearly sort of stands out as the black sheep, of India Inc., if you like. So
Right.
there'll definitely be a lot of support from a large part of the community. But I think we've got to understand that today India has become so polarized in either favor of the government or against the government. From a sort of public sentiment perspective, but let me just say, dissent is not encouraged.
It's interesting here in the States, at least from a public sentiment perspective. I think everyone, we saw many brands rushing to try to make the right statement with COVID, right? We're in this together, recreating their ad spots for, and we've seen the YouTube videos that did the kind of compilation of all of the same phrases being used again and again on overload, ad nauseum, ad infinitum. And now I think that has started a trend of feeling a need and a forcing to respond to everything. And, here we've seen, in the wake of the George Floyd murder, we've seen so many brands who have no right to say something on this issue because they have never participated previously, trying to find something to say. And, we can see the good ones. We can see Glossier is a great example. Ben & Jerry's is a pinnacle example. And then we see those trusted brands that have stepped out provocatively and meaningfully in the past, like when Nike did with the Colin Kaepernick ad and the Dream Crazy campaign, kind of stepping in it. And Nike's having a moment of reckoning where they put out their small piece of content and they got a lot of backlash because they haven't fixed what's hurting inside of their own organization. So these are so interdependent. And now the CEO, John Donahoe, has said, look, I recognize we can't put out a piece of content that says that we're with Black Lives Matter if we have not handled ourselves internally in better ways.
So Ben, I'm conscious we're going to lose you in a few minutes. So just a final question to you. I mean, how big a price could brands theoretically pay for, going along with the Black Lives Matter movement, but then being shown to be vapid and empty behind the, the sort of the blanked out black tweets?
Well, I think if there's massive hypocrisy and you've got a particular niche audience who are very sensitive to it, because salience of Black Lives Matter, the media is full of it, but it does vary depending on generation. There are big generational differences within ethnic groups about how they react to this. But no, you can destroy your business. It can be a Ratner moment. For those on the call who don't remember Mr. Ratner, he stood up and he ran a chain of jewelry shops, and he stood up and said that our product is basically crap as a joke at a business conference. And the customers left, and he basically went bankrupt. So we know that you can do it. And so if somebody does something utterly crass and is then found out to have been massively discriminatory, says one thing about Black Lives Matter and then turns out to have been massively discriminatory, and they're not they're not Amazon or something, then undoubtedly they can suffer. And I think it is difficult because if you speak up on this and you're not particularly you're not I don't know in something that is particularly focused on that, do you then move on to the treatment of people in Hong Kong, or what are the next issues around the world that we might be talking about in the next year? Do you start to have a stance on all of these things? And I think people do want business to speak up, actually. Ultimately, they also want business to deliver good quality products safely and be good citizens. But there does come a point where, you're almost running a press operation commenting on the news. If because there are so many appropriate causes that you might want to say something about.
And I remember when the Brexit referendum result came about, when I was at Vodafone, the debate we had within Vodafone, which was similar to many other companies, about what should be our position on this, because for any large multinational company based in the UK, without exception, in my experience, Brexit was a significant operating risk. And there was a lot of pressure from within the employees of the organization to actually take a stance on Brexit. The problem is that Brexit, by definition, like other things that we could talk about, is divisive. It's polarizing in society. And if a company comes out with a position, by definition, it will exclude a part of its customer base. And so the solution was to say very little or nothing. I guess that.
I think it can work if you're willing to put up with the scrutiny that comes afterwards. And Nike's sales went up by 10% after they backed Colin Kaepernick and take a kneel, etc., etc. So it can work, but you better be absolutely sure before you do, once the media come after you, that you don't have any dirty linen that you aren't ready to see in the newspapers. I'm going to have to leave you all. Really interesting discussion, and I look forward to joining you another time. But anyway,
great. Thank you for your time, Ben.
Actually, Matt, one of the things that Ben just said that's super interesting to me is, Nike sales went up in the wake of Dream Crazy. However, there was massive backlash in the beginning with, a huge Twitter storm of people burning their Nikes. And then there was the pendulum swung the other way with a few pivotal, outspoken celebrities on nighttime television saying, hey, I'm here in my Nikes. And then it was punctuated by a CNN story where the CEO of Nike said, was asked the question, like, you started this sort of, this explosion of people burning their Nikes. Are you experiencing a drawback in sales? And his response was fascinating to me. He said, we were never aiming for that audience. This campaign was aimed at 14 to 20-year-old young people, because we align with that value system of standing for the right things and being on the right side of these issues. And if you're my age, an old lady, and burning Nikes, we weren't talking to you anyways. And so I think that it speaks to, audience matters, who you're talking to and how you're talking to them matters. But I also think there's a couple of other things that a brand has to think about before they decide whether or not to make a statement or not, and if it's material to them. The first is like, is it tied to your brand? Tonally against your purpose? Is it in line with the business? Is it helping others or helping ourselves, right? Are you putting out a post on Black Lives Matter or on how we're all in this together if you're not taking care of the people in your own workforce who may be hungry, who may be struggling with healthcare, with a family member who has COVID? Creating impact at speed and scale, I think, is really important to consider. If you're going to put a commitment out, can you back it up? And then to a point that an attendee asked, is it CEO defendable? Is this something that a CEO can feel strongly about having a position on and being able to comment on transparently, actively, and then back it up with action?
So really interesting question just come in from Philip, which he actually asked the question in the context of what I said earlier about TCFD and public company reporting obligations. But it's a broader point about the difference between public companies that ultimately are held to account by their institutional shareholders, by the BlackRocks, the Fidelities and Alliances and so forth of the world, versus private companies and family-owned companies. And historically, private businesses have much more flexibility to design however they want to operate. So a private company can become a B Corp, for example, can choose to do so. And Patagonia is one of the biggest B Corps in the world, partly because it is a private company. Public companies historically have been driven by the kind of Milton Friedman cult of shareholder value creation. Everything is about driving shareholder returns, and everything that's not the shareholder return is ancillary. So the underlying point, I think, behind Philip's question is that now changing? Is that changing because institutional investors have woken up and realized what ESG risk means, what not having a credible purpose means, and are worried about value destruction? And has the equation flipped so that actually public companies are leading this more than private companies? Let me come to Girish first just to answer that question, because in India you have an interesting mix of public and private. Do you see a difference between companies that are public, that have institutional shareholders, versus private companies that are family owned in terms of their understanding of purpose and ESG risk?
Absolutely. So you're spot on there, Matt. The public companies, of course, are a lot more sort of careful with the causes that they sort of commit to and the way in which they spend their money towards things that will sort of take away from shareholder value. However, having said that, what I'm sort of excited about is that India has very strong economic ambitions. The Prime Minister sort of announced that, he wants to make India a $5 trillion economy, in the next 5 years. Now, that's not going to happen without attracting a huge amount of foreign investment. And foreign investment, when it comes, is going to come with this demand.
Yeah.
So I think it's that pull from the investors and their need to sort of see a stronger ESG focus is what is going to drive a lot of it in the next 5 years. And I think that's something to be really hopeful about.
What about in the US, Laura? I mean, there was a moment last year where the Business Roundtable, which is this kind of club of the CEOs of the top 140 companies in the US, signed this statement of principles that essentially tore up 40 years worth of Milton Friedman, the economist Milton Friedman, who sort of created this notion of shareholder value being the only thing companies should focus on. They kind of tore that up and said, no. From now on, we are absolutely going to focus on all of our stakeholders, including and especially our employees and our communities, and it's no longer about shareholder primacy. And then, of course, what's happened since is a number of those companies have fallen off the back of the wagon through COVID, and there's a great deal of cynicism about what they meant. Do you see a difference in public companies pressured by their institutional investors versus family-owned and private businesses? And if so, has that difference shifted in the last few years, would you say?
Yeah, I can give you a couple of examples. So I've worked with Cliff Bar & Company, which is a family-owned business. They've been independent, not owned by a parent, for more than almost 30 years now. They have a very rigorous sustainability framework. They have a 5 aspirations model, so they go beyond triple bottom line, and they're willing to take risks on climate issues and take a greater stand because they can, because they're privately owned. It's also in line with their value system. So it speaks to how they were started and how they've operated. We have a couple of clients actually, who now that ESG is popular, and these are brands who have they put out their CSR and sustainability reports more as marketing collateral than against any level of rigor on goals that are 2030 and trackable. They are being pressured by investors. They are being asked difficult questions on earnings calls about ESG, and they don't know what to do. And so what I'm noticing is that public facing brands that have never thought about this stuff before want to jettison overdoing the basics to claim the moniker of ESG without having done the work, without having looked at their own climate risks and setting some goals, or even alignment with the SDGs. So I think that, and then we've got clients like Walmart, and who have been an innovator and a leader in these areas for a very, very long time. So it's almost irrespective of COVID in many ways. I think that these questions were starting to be asked 18 months ago here in the States, and asked more by investors to public brands than private.
I mean, I'll give my own quick answer to the question, because I think it's probably one of the most fundamental questions we'll touch on is, what's happening with public companies versus private companies and purpose and ESG. And then I want to just touch on a question that Rod has asked, which I think is really interesting. So my perspective is that what public companies have experienced is that there is now market data that cost of capital and cost of debt is a great deal higher for a business with a poor ESG rating than for a business that's AAA rated. And to put that in context, the difference in the US between an ESG leader and an ESG laggard in terms of cost of capital is around 100 basis points, which for those of you who are not into the economics of it is a lot. Yeah, if you've got sort of 30, 40, 50 billion dollars of debt, as a large multinational easily could do, you know, a 1% movement annually in your cost of debt is not trivial. Yeah, and that's really, really focused minds. And I think private companies and private equity in particular is coming late to the party. And they're coming late to the party because they're starting to find it harder to raise capital unless they have credible ESG scores. Yeah, but public companies were there first. So that's kind of just to add to it, my own experience. Right, really good question from Rod. And Girish, I see you've given a short answer on the chat, which I agree with. But the question is, given that you've got different cultures, different speeds of adoption around ESG and purpose in different countries, is there a kind of consistent global message set that works everywhere, that a multinational corporation can uniformly apply everywhere, or that advisory firms can take into any company in any context in any country and you'll know it will work? Girish, let me start with you, because you've quite rightly said, be cautious. You need to understand the local context. But is there anything that's kind of globally consistent around purpose and ESG, do you think, that works everywhere?
I can't think of anything right now, Matt, but you know, you got me thinking of an example of, let's take eBay as an example. I think many years ago, you know, when there was sort of questions around the US's sort of immigration policies, I think eBay had sort of come out very strongly to say, we're going to hire 10,000, you know, immigrants in the next 5 years, sort of, you know, really taking a stand on that. And then, you know, if I think about, you know, could eBay India sort of, you know, have done something, you know, equally sort of confidently? I highly doubt it. You know, if I was the sort of, you know, person working on the account in India, my advice would be to sort of, you know, really calibrate it based on, you know, sort of local sort of context before going to market.
Yeah, Laura?
Yeah, it's I'm actually in the middle of this right now with a client who's getting ready to launch their first ever global purpose. And it's clunky, I will not lie. What works in one market, what the cultural tension is, what the messaging tension is, and even down to word choice in one part of the world doesn't necessarily port over. And I think that brand may be looking at it not from the center, as opposed to you know, looking at the language around it. And that language words matter. But I think before you craft a set of messages that can work consistently around the globe, I think a brand that is truly intentional on drivers around social impact or ESG need to look at the human need state. What are they solving for first? And then, and this is where it would be great if Ben was here, because I'm sure he'd have a lot to say on this.
Yeah.
You know, how does that then work around the globe? Like, how can we take that human need state and test it in markets to make sure that there is consistency around it truly being something that needs to be solved for, and it truly being something that is material to the business? And then I think if you find a high level of consistency, then you can start to craft language and test out language that will be equally consistent. But if you start with the end result of how do we want to sound, or what are the words we want to use, I think that we're jumping over the way that a brand can actually make social impact and create some systemic change.
Yeah, no, look, I agree with that. I mean, I think my answer to Rod's challenge is you need to disaggregate the 6 different bits of ESG to get different answers. So ESG is essentially an amalgam of 6 different things. You've got the E is climate on the one side, ecology and natural resource on the other side. The S is the internal stakeholders, so your workforce, and then your external stakeholders, which is predominantly about human rights. And then the G is kind of traditional corporate governance on the one side, and then on the other side it's corporate culture, business integrity, things like corruption and transparency and so forth, right? So it's 6 quite heterogeneous things actually that are bolted together. That is ESG. And the reason why I say that is because some of the bits of ESG, in my experience, have global commonality. Climate, carbon, yeah? You can have conversations about carbon impact, about the need to work towards a zero carbon year, about the need to transition to renewable power, pretty much safely everywhere in the world. Yeah, it's a uniform thing. Ecological impact and resource management, similarly. You then kind of go through a spectrum of the other bits of ESG. So around the governance aspects, particularly around business integrity issues, it gets a bit more complicated depending on where you are. And then at the far end of the spectrum, but again, in my experience, the very hardest bit of all of this is human rights, where, to give you one instance from my own career, LGBT plus company global position, yeah? When you have a multinational that operates in the US, it operates in Europe, but it also operates in the GCC countries in the Middle East, and it also operates right the way across Asia and across Africa, including countries in which gay people are subject to criminal law. Yeah, you cannot have a globally consistent position that's visible to the world in all of those countries on LGBT plus. You can't. Because if you do, you actually put people in danger. And a bit like the conversation we had earlier about India and about this sort of sectarian violence that was happening before COVID, Girish, for a company to have a position on something as divisive as that involves a level of risk for that company, and most companies won't do it. So I think the E is quite straightforward in terms of a global position. The G is kind of half and half, and the S is actually pretty tricky, would be my short answer to Rod's question. I don't know, Girish, would you agree with that, again, from your experience?
Yeah, that sounds about right, Matt. I'd agree with that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was going to ask you, Girish, here we're seeing a lot of media coverage in the first month after the pandemic hit and everyone stayed home, that, the air was cleaner in Los Angeles. And the rivers were, all of a sudden you could see the bottom of the rivers. And so we are seeing the connection for anybody who doesn't want to, who's a science climate denier, who's actually seeing the impacts of the human toil on climate, right? But then we're seeing this as a dual sword, because while we may be seeing cleaner air in Los Angeles, we are no longer allowed, because of the pandemic, to bring recyclable bags into the grocery store. So all of that plastic work and, all of the bag bans around the world and here in the States that we've seen really start to make a meaningful difference around ocean plastics. It's like we tossed it all out the window because everyone's trying to be safe, and it's the right thing to do. But I fear that there will be this sort of pendulum swing. People are starting to get out now again, based on phasing of returning back into the world in safe ways. And everybody is sort of going crazy, trying to be out and about. So I wonder if you're seeing some of that in India, particularly, with some of the climate impacts because of COVID.
So absolutely, Laura. I think sort of everybody's witnessed it and has sort of seen, blue skies, cleaner water, fresher air, and all of that good stuff. At the same time, I guess the question is how much of this is really transient versus, permanent. And, as a nation, we've been through almost 70 days of lockdown, which is the largest, in the world.
Wow.
And so, the question has really come back to lives or livelihoods. Which do we protect? And after 70 days sort of coming out of the lockdown, day one, you're back to traffic jams on the street. And of course, there's a reason for that, which is, people don't want to use public transport anymore. Everybody's back in their sort of single cars and vehicles and stuff like that. However, having said that, I guess what is really encouraging about what's happening in India is that, the Prime Minister, who is sort of almost seen like a cult figure and is very divisive, has also sort of publicly taken a stand on climate change. I think, at the World Economic Forum in 2019, he sort of talked about it as being one of the biggest threats facing mankind. And of course, he's committed India to a huge and ambitious renewable energy sort of program, which says we're going to put 450 gigawatts worth of renewable energy by 2030. Now, today, India has about 90 gigawatts. We've got another 360 to add in 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Now, 360 gigawatts is actually all of India's installed capacity today.
Yeah.
And we're going to double that in renewables in the next 10 years. So clearly, because of the sort of political will behind it, I think we're going to see a lot of good things come, our way, and very badly needed so, because the air quality is just, it's like the pandemic. It's just that we've not taken it as seriously. And I think as we've gone through the pandemic, of course, we've seen that if we have to, we can change behavior. People can be people just be in their homes and not get out there and pollute everything. So clearly it's possible, and we've seen it is. Now it's just a question of, do we treat issues like climate change with the same urgency that we have the pandemic?
We've got 8 minutes remaining on the webinar, and let's just bring this a bit closer to home to our profession. And a really good question from Sam that's just come in about PR agencies and the advisory world that those of us on the advisory side are in. So what Sam says, you can maybe see this in the Q&A. I don't know if everyone can see this, but many agencies are now claiming they have sustainability or purpose expertise, but actually how many of them really do? How many agencies are essentially identifying the commercial opportunity that sits here and are taking communication skills and applying them to what are actually, certainly in ESG, in my experience, highly technical craft areas? Laura, what's your view?
This is a loaded question. As somebody I've spent my entire career of almost 29 years in agencies. I've worked for 6. I've worked for the 3 largest holding companies, and I also owned my own agency for 11 years that focused exclusively on these issues, long before it was popular. I think that this world is increasingly small. I think that there's a big difference, just to be blunt, for anyone who knows me, that's how I roll, between the makers and the fakers. And I think because it feels good to do work that has social impact, everyone wants to do it, whether they have true expertise in it or not. And then there's some of the old guard of us who've been working in it since the early mid 90s, long before it was a thing. That community is very small. And so I think finding the right mentor is going to be really important. And you will know when you start interviewing around at different agencies, when agencies are hiring again, some of those that are leading in these areas. I think I work for a global agency, but I do think that there are many boutiques that do this brilliantly. And have a little bit more freedom because they're not owned by a holding company to take chances or to take risks with brands that maybe a large company wouldn't otherwise, a large agency wouldn't otherwise take on, leading with your belief system. And then the last thing I'll just say about this is I teach college at DePaul University, which is one of the best PR schools in the country here. And so I hear directly from undergrads about what they are looking for when they want to work for, when they want to join the workforce. And my class is about the basics. It's about the principles of PR. It's not about purpose. But I would say that 60% of our curriculum is driven by the students, and that's all they want to talk about.
Yeah.
So there is a young workforce who are coming up, who are choosing to work in agencies that do this kind of work, or at least have it as a component, because it's really important to young people.
Yeah, I lecture at international business schools on ESG at a place like London Business School and IESE in Spain, and I'm a visiting fellow at the Henley Business School, and I find the same thing. That there's a fascination amongst the new generation of business leaders in the topics of purpose and ESG. It's, deeply, deeply rooted interest, which is actually really encouraging. But let me just come, Girish, to you on this question from Sam about agencies. I mean, you established your agency because you have such a strong belief in the future of purpose in business, right? So what do you find in the advisory world in India? Do you find that the sort of the challenge that Sam's identified in his question?
Absolutely. I think it's a great question, Sam. And, I'd sort of openly admit that I think we're more enthusiastic about it than we are sort of experts in it. I think we've sort of all taken our background and expertise in communications, and we've sort of tried to apply it to an area that we're personally passionate about and are hoping to develop the skills as we go. Having said that, I think, we're very conscious of it, that, it can't be a differentiation just in sort of positioning, but also in capability and sort of methodology in terms of how we do things. And in that respect, we're sort of moving towards, exploring people who have skills in behavioral economics, as an example, just people who sort of, know how to apply nudge theory to how people respond, and sort of are motivated by the right sort of, nudges. So I completely sort of agree and admit that I think it's more an intent right now than it is sort of a reality. And I think I don't think there are any sort of agencies in India that really have the proper capability to sort of look at purpose really sort of purposefully.
You know what, Matt, one thing too, and it just, Girish, what you said just reminded me, I think being a specialist is special, right? I mean, there's a reason why, you want to go work in a certain area, if it's ESG or, climate, but as an agency person or as a communicator, you have to know the basics first. And it's what I tell my students all the time, and I tell people on teams that I get to work on, if you don't know how to write, if you don't know the fundamentals of engaging with the media,
Absolutely.
don't understand social media and how it's such a driver for culture today, and how to communicate effectively and engage, you can decide to be a specialist for, and because of passion, but for the craft of public relations, you have to know what you're doing there first, before that's your foundation upon which you can specialize and make a difference in the world.
Right, we've got 2 minutes left. I'm going to ask one quick question of each of you, and give me a 30-second answer, no longer, please. Who in the company, so on the client side, who in the company should own purpose and ESG? Which function, which individual, which role? Laura.
Oh, you're killing me with this answer. I think that it's a two-part answer. I think that it needs to have oversight from, I think it's a triumvirate, really. Diversity and inclusion, finance,
yep,
and marketing.
Yep.
I think it is not one place. It can't live in one place in the same way that ESG cannot just be focused on environment or governance. It has to have some shared ownership. If you truly want to make some change, it has to have a bit of shared ownership, and it has to have shared buy-in.
Yep. Girish, what's your view?
Purpose by the CEO. Some of my clients have a chief sustainability officer where maybe ESG might sit better, but otherwise I'd say CFO.
Right, my very brief answer before, I don't know if you're going to come back in, Rod, and close out, but my very brief answer is the CFO, because nothing happens without the money, and the corporate affairs director and the CCO, because unless you tell the world you're doing it, you might as well not do it. There we go. That's my slightly glib answer. Rod, do you want to come back in to close out, or shall I close out?
And if you want to do a little summary, I'll just wrap up and give people details of next week. So if you want to do your closing words, I'll close out ultimately.
Well, my closing words is to say thank you to Laura, thank you to Girish, and also thank you to Ben for their time. Hopefully that was a really useful conversation for everyone. It was what you call wide-ranging. For what it's worth, I'm an optimist about all of this. I think we are at a hinge point in history, and I think that much as capitalism caused many of the problems we're dealing with now, capitalism is the cure for many of the problems we're dealing with now. So on that note, I leave you hopefully feeling slightly more optimistic than you did an hour ago. Rod.
Brilliant. And a personal thank you to all of you. I think it's been a fascinating session. Those who are regular attendees on these will realise that we're kind of alternating between big picture, which was today's focus, and sort of immediate practical. We have a session next week on a topic that I think covers both, which is the absolutely vital discussion around mental health and employee well-being. So there's a session this time next Tuesday with the American Psychological Association. So we're bringing in some deep expertise in the psychology of COVID-19, what it means for mental health, what it means for well-being. So again, thank you for joining today. We hope you can join next week's fascinating and important session. Stay safe everywhere, Laura, you particularly, and we'll see you next week. Thank you again.
Thanks all. Cheers. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.